There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around without knowing it, a version shaped by congressional hearings that buried their own findings, by military press releases that described events no one on the ground would recognize, by photographs that were cleared for publication precisely because they showed the right amount of suffering in the right proportions. That version of the war was not accidental. It was assembled piece by people who understood that a conflict of this scale required a narrative architecture just as much as it required artillery, and for a long time, that architecture held. Not because it was convincing, but because the alternative, the actual record of what happened inside the chain of command, inside the field reports, inside the medical examiner's logs, and the classified after-action summaries, was simply not available to the people who would have been most disturbed by it. What follows is drawn from that other record. Not the dramatic record, not the record of heroic last stands or clean strategic errors, but the institutional record, the record of how a military and a government continued to prosecute a war they had, in private, already determined could not be won, and what that determination did to the men who were sent to fight it, and what it did to the truth, and what it did to the silence that came after. The first thing to understand is that the war was not misunderstood. That is the comfortable version. The comfortable version says that the American public was deceived, that good faith errors compounded over years, that the fog of war obscured the reality on the ground from policymakers who would have made different decisions with better information. That version is not supported by the documents. The documents show something more precise and more uncomfortable. They show that senior officials at the Pentagon and in the White House had access to accurate assessments of the war's trajectory as early as 1964 and 1965, and that those assessments were systematically suppressed, reclassified, or simply ignored in the formulation of public statements. The gap between what was known and what was said was not a product of confusion. It was a product of policy. In 1967, the Systems Analysis Office of the Department of Defense produced internal studies indicating that American bombing campaigns in North Vietnam were failing to achieve their stated objectives. Supply routes continued to function. Industrial capacity had been dispersed in ways that made targeting ineffective. North Vietnamese troop infiltration into the South was not declining. These findings were available to Robert McNamara, available to the Joint Chiefs, available to Lyndon Johnson. The public statements issued during the same period described the bombing campaign as producing measurable degradation of enemy capability and described the overall military situation as trending in a favorable direction. Both things were true simultaneously. The internal finding and the public statement, they simply described different realities, and only one of those realities was available to the men who were being drafted. A soldier arriving in Vietnam in 1967 or 1968 was entering a war that his own government had already quietly assessed as unwinnable by conventional military means. He did not know this. His officers did not tell him this because his officers had not been told. Information traveled vertically in ways that were designed to preserve the forward motion of the institution rather than to accurately represent conditions. A lieutenant in the Mekong Delta did not know what a colonel in Saigon knew, and a colonel in Saigon did not know what the civilian analysts in Washington knew, and what the civilian analysts in Washington knew was carefully kept from the people who were formulating the doctrines that the colonel was implementing and that the lieutenant was executing in the field. This was not a breakdown in communication. This was communication functioning exactly as it had been designed to function. The body count system is where the institutional contradiction becomes most visible. But it is important to understand that the body count did not begin as a cynical invention. It began as a measurement problem. In a war without front lines, without the capture of territory as a consistent objective, the traditional metrics of military success did not apply. You could not point to a map and show a line moving in a favorable direction. There was no line. There were operations, insertions, firefights, withdrawals, and then the same ground would need to be cleared again 6 weeks later. The body count emerged as an attempt to quantify progress in an environment where progress had no obvious spatial expression. The intention was administrative. The effect was something else entirely. By 1966, the body count had become the primary metric by which unit performance was evaluated, and by which commanding officers justified their operational decisions, and by which the Pentagon justified its budget requests, and by which the administration justified the war to the public. A number that had started as an attempt to measure battlefield effectiveness had become the foundation of the entire justification architecture. And because it was the foundation of that architecture, pressure began to flow downward through the chain of command to produce numbers that sustained the architecture, not in explicit orders, not in written directives that could later be cited, but in the accumulated weight of institutional expectation, in the way promotions happened and the way after-action reviews were conducted, and the way a unit commander's competence was assessed by his superiors. The number needed to be good, and if the number needed to be good, and if the actual battlefield situation was not producing good numbers, then the definition of what constituted a confirmed enemy killed needed to become more flexible. What flexible meant in practice is documented in veteran testimony, in unit logs, and in the internal army investigations that were conducted during and after the war. It meant that Vietnamese civilians killed during operations were routinely counted as enemy combatants. It meant that estimates of enemy casualties were reported as confirmed figures. It meant that individuals found in or near areas designated as free fire zones were assumed to be enemy forces regardless of age, gender, or any other indicator. The Army's own internal investigation, conducted in 1971 by the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group, documented hundreds of incidents in which civilians had been killed and subsequently counted as enemy killed in action. The investigation's findings were classified. They remained classified for decades. The public record during the same period described enemy kill ratios as evidence that the war of attrition was working. There is a particular document that illustrates this gap with unusual clarity. In February of 1968, a few weeks after the Tet Offensive had demonstrated that American and South Vietnamese forces had failed to anticipate or prevent a coordinated nationwide attack, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, William Westmoreland, sent a cable to Washington requesting 206,000 additional troops. The request was significant not only for its scale, but for its candor. In the internal messaging surrounding that request, Westmoreland and his staff acknowledged that the previous years of operations had not produced the results that had been publicly claimed. The optimism that had characterized press briefings in Saigon bore no relationship to the situation Westmoreland was now describing to his superiors in private. The request was leaked to the press. The public reaction contributed to Johnson's decision not to seek re-election, and the 206,000 troops were never sent. But the request itself, and the private assessments that accompanied it, were never fully reconciled with the years of official optimism that had preceded them. There was no official accounting. There was no formal acknowledgement that the public had been told things that were not true. The machinery simply moved forward, as it was designed to do. The psychological effects of operating inside this contradiction were not invisible to the people experiencing them. What is unusual about the Vietnam War's internal record is the degree to which soldiers, officers, chaplains, military psychiatrists, and even some commanders documented their own deterioration in real time. The Army's medical records from this period include psychiatric evaluations, letters that were never mailed, and clinical notes from combat stress units that describe something more specific than the general trauma of war. They describe the particular disorientation of fighting in a war whose objectives shifted, whose rules of engagement changed without explanation, whose enemy was indistinguishable from the population the mission was nominally designed to protect, and whose metrics of success seemed designed to demonstrate progress that the participants could not themselves observe. A combat soldier in 1969, 2 years after Tet had shattered the official narrative of momentum, was often operating under conditions that had no coherent strategic justification that he had been given. He knew that units had swept the same villages multiple times. He knew that locations declared pacified had been attacked again. He knew that the South Vietnamese forces his unit was supposed to be training and handing operational responsibility to were, in many cases, neither willing nor able to perform the role they had been assigned in the official transition timeline. He knew all of this from direct experience. What he did not know, and what the institution had no mechanism for telling him, was what to do with that knowledge. So most of the time, he did nothing with it. He completed his tour. He rotated home, and the institution continued. The practice of declaring hamlets and villages pacified deserves particular attention because it represents one of the more precisely documented examples of how official reporting diverged from observed reality. The Hamlet evaluation system, introduced in 1967, was designed to provide a comprehensive statistical picture of progress in the pacification program, which was the civilian and paramilitary effort to secure the rural South Vietnamese population against National Liberation Front influence. The system assigned ratings to thousands of hamlets across the country based on criteria, including security conditions, government presence, economic activity, and population attitudes. The ratings were compiled monthly and sent up the chain of command, where they were aggregated and used to demonstrate that the pacification program was succeeding. The percentage of the population living in hamlets rated as secure or relatively secure increased steadily in the official reports throughout 1968 and 1969. The people conducting the evaluations in the field knew that the data was not reliable. They knew this for several reasons. They knew it because the criteria for evaluation were subjective and subject to interpretation by evaluators whose careers were affected by the ratings they produced. They knew it because evaluations were often conducted during daylight hours, when the government presence in a hamlet was visible and the guerrilla presence was not, and because conditions changed between evaluations in ways that the monthly snapshot system could not capture. They knew it because, in many cases, the local officials who were supposed to confirm the security of their areas were themselves in various degrees of accommodation with NLF forces and had every incentive to report their areas as secure. The internal reports from pacification advisors, from CIA provincial analysts, from USAID field staff, repeatedly noted these limitations. The data fed into the Hamlet evaluation system was described in internal correspondence as deeply unreliable. The summary statistics produced from that data were presented to Congress and to the public as evidence of progress. It is important to be precise about what this means. It does not mean that every official who cited those statistics was consciously lying. Some of them believed the numbers. Some of them had been isolated from the field long enough that the administrative reality of improving percentages had displaced any contact with the physical reality those percentages were supposed to represent. The institution produced believers as well as cynics. What it did not produce was a mechanism for correction. There was no system by which a field evaluator's private assessment that the data was unreliable could travel upward through the chain of command and affect the summary statistics that were being sent to Washington. The system was designed to aggregate information, not to interrogate it. The rules of engagement in Vietnam were among the most complex and most frequently revised in American military history, and the internal record of how they were understood, misunderstood, and selectively applied is one of the more disquieting aspects of the documentary archive. At the formal level, the rules were designed to distinguish between combatants and civilians, to limit collateral damage, to comply with international humanitarian law, and to maintain the political viability of the mission by avoiding the kind of civilian casualties that would alienate the South Vietnamese population. At the operational level, in the field, under conditions of ambiguity and threat and exhaustion and fear, the rules functioned differently. Free fire zones, officially designated as specified strike zones, were areas in which the military presumed that any person present was a legitimate target. The designation was supposed to follow from a determination that civilian populations had been evacuated and that anyone remaining was engaged in hostile activity. In practice, the designations were applied to large areas of the countryside, including areas where civilian populations had not been fully evacuated. where farmers continued to work land that had been in their families for generations, where the logistical and political obstacles to evacuation had simply not been overcome. Once a zone was designated, the presumption of hostility attached to everyone in it, and the body count numbers generated from operations in those zones fed into the same statistical architecture that was being used to demonstrate progress. The designation created a category. The category determined the count. The count supported the narrative. The internal Army investigation that examined war crimes from 1965 through 1972, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group, compiled files on more than 300 incidents. The investigation was initiated partly in response to public attention following the My Lai massacre, but its scope went well beyond that single event. The files included sworn statements from soldiers, officer testimony, after-action reports, criminal investigation division records, and in some cases photographic evidence. The investigation identified incidents in which prisoners were executed, in which civilians were killed during interrogations, in which villages were burned without military justification, in which bodies were mutilated to inflate enemy casualty counts. The investigation produced files. The files were classified. The prosecutions that resulted from the investigation were minimal. The institutional response to the investigation was to contain it rather than to act on it, and the files remained classified until 1994, when they were released under the Freedom of Information Act. The gap between that internal record and the public narrative of the war was not static. It widened over time, and it widened in ways that affected different parts of the institution differently. Senior officers who served multiple tours and who understood the private assessments became, in some cases, skilled operators of the gap. People who knew simultaneously what the war was and what it had to be described as being, and who navigated between those two realities with a fluency that was almost professional. Junior officers who served one tour and returned to civilian life sometimes carried a different relationship to the gap, one characterized less by fluency than by a persistent sense that the experience they had had bore no relationship to the experience that was being officially described. That dislocation produced, in many cases, silence rather than protest. The machinery had no place for protest, it had ample place for silence. The fragging incidents, documented in Army criminal investigation records, represent one form that resistance took when protest was not viable. Fragging, the deliberate killing or wounding of officers and non-commissioned officers by their own troops, typically using fragmentation grenades to obscure the evidence, increased significantly as the war entered its later years. The Army documented over 900 fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. These were the confirmed incidents. The actual number was almost certainly higher, because not all incidents were reported, and because the institutional incentive to investigate and document insubordination within a combat unit was complicated by the same pressures that shaped the rest of the institutional record. The official response to fragging data was to treat it as a discipline and morale problem, which it was, and to address it through command changes and unit reorganizations without addressing the conditions that produced it. Those conditions were specific, and they are documented. They included the rotation system, in which individual soldiers served one-year tours that decoupled unit cohesion from individual experience, so that at any given moment a unit might contain soldiers at every stage of their tour, from the newly arrived, who were still learning what kind of war they were in, to the short-timers who were close enough to their rotation date to feel that the risk calculus of following an aggressive officer's orders had become unfavorable. They included the declining morale associated with widespread knowledge that the war was being wound down politically, even as operations continued, producing the particular demoralization of being asked to fight and die in a war that the institution had already, at its highest levels, decided to exit. They included drug availability, which was unusually high in Vietnam relative to previous American conflicts, and which the institution initially failed to recognize and then failed to effectively address. And they included the specific and documented phenomenon of combat refusals, instances in which soldiers or entire units declined to execute orders, which increased in frequency in the war's later years and which were handled with a degree of institutional discretion that reflected the military's awareness that it could not prosecute its way out of a morale crisis. The intelligence apparatus in Vietnam produced its own parallel record of contradiction and suppression. The CIA's internal assessments of the political situation in South Vietnam, available through declassified documents, consistently described the Saigon government's legitimacy and popular support in terms that were dramatically more pessimistic than the official public assessments. As early as 1963, CIA analysts were documenting evidence that the Diem government had lost the confidence of substantial portions of the rural population, that the strategic Hamlet program was generating resentment rather than loyalty, that the military situation in the Mekong Delta was deteriorating rather than improving. These assessments were available to senior policymakers. They did not produce policy changes that would have reflected their content. The pattern continued throughout the war. Intelligence assessments that contradicted the official narrative were routinely described by senior officials as too pessimistic, as reflecting analyst bias, as failing to account for factors that supported a more optimistic interpretation. The process by which intelligence is supposed to inform policy became, in this case, a process by which policy shaped the reception of intelligence. Analysts who produced consistently negative assessments found their assessments challenged, their judgment questioned, their findings subjected to review processes that sometimes produced alternative assessments more compatible with the preferred narrative. This is not a characterization. It is described in internal memoranda, in the testimony of CIA officials before congressional committees, and in the personal accounts of analysts who worked in Vietnam during the war. There is a specific episode involving the order of battle dispute of 1967 that illustrates this mechanism with unusual precision. In 1967, CIA analyst Samuel Adams produced a revised estimate of the total size of enemy forces in South Vietnam. Adams's estimate, based on captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and field reporting, concluded that the enemy order of battle was significantly larger than the official military estimate being used as the basis for strategic planning. The discrepancy was not small. Adams estimated enemy forces at over 500,000. The official military estimate was approximately 270,000. The difference was not attributable to different methodologies or different data sets. It was attributable to a decision, documented in internal communications, to exclude certain categories of enemy forces from the official count, specifically the self-defense and secret self-defense forces, in order to prevent the official estimate from reaching a level that would be politically problematic. The practical consequence of using the lower estimate was significant. If the official estimate was correct, then the kill ratios being reported were producing meaningful attrition. If Adams' estimate was correct, then the same kill ratios were not keeping pace with enemy recruitment and infiltration, and the war of attrition was not working. The dispute was resolved by institutional pressure rather than by analysis. The official estimate was maintained. Adams continued to press his case internally and was eventually marginalized. The Tet Offensive, launched in January 1968, involved forces whose size was far closer to Adams's estimate than to the official figure. The intelligence failure that allowed Tet to be described as a surprise was not a failure of information collection. It was a failure that had been built into the system through the management of inconvenient data. The Phoenix program, which operated from 1968 through 1972, was designed to identify and neutralize, a term whose meaning expanded over the program's operation, members of the NLF's political infrastructure in South Vietnam. The program was conceived as an intelligence-driven effort to dismantle the organizational network that sustained guerrilla operations, and at its best, which was in specific provinces with experienced and disciplined advisors, it produced meaningful intelligence and targeted operations against actual NLF cadres. At its worst, and the internal record documents this in considerable detail, it became a mechanism through which provincial officials settled personal and political scores through which informants made false accusations that were acted upon without verification, and through which the neutralization quota system, which required provincial units to produce a certain number of neutralizations per month, was fulfilled by methods that bore no relationship to the program's stated intelligence. Objectives. The quota system is particularly well documented. CORDS, the Civil Operations and Revolutionary Development Support Organization that administered the program, established provincial quotas for the number of VCI, Viet Cong infrastructure members, to be neutralized each month. The quotas varied by province and were adjusted over time, but their existence created the same incentive structure that had corrupted the body count system. If a quota had to be met, and if intelligence assets were insufficient to identify the required number of actual VCI members, then the definition of who constituted VCI became flexible in ways that were convenient. Internal CORDS reports, some of which were declassified in the 1970s and 1980s, document complaints from provincial advisors about quota pressure, about the unreliability of the neutralization data, about cases in which individuals had been killed or imprisoned based on accusations that could not be verified and that in some cases were clearly fabricated. The official statistics for the Phoenix program reported that between 1968 and 1972, approximately 80,000 NLF infrastructure members were neutralized, of whom approximately 26,000 were killed. Congressional testimony in 1971, including testimony from former program director William Colby, acknowledged that some innocent people had been killed under the program. The internal record suggests that the scale of that acknowledged problem was larger than the public testimony indicated. An internal CORDS study from 1970, classified at the time, estimated that a significant percentage of those counted as neutralized VCI had been incorrectly identified, either as a result of informant error, informant fabrication, or deliberate misclassification to meet quota requirements. The study's findings did not change program policy. The quotas continued. The statistics continued to be reported as evidence of the program's effectiveness. The civilian casualty numbers in Vietnam are among the most contested figures in the war's statistical record, and the contestation itself is part of the story. The official military reporting system did not include a systematic mechanism for tracking civilian casualties caused by American or South Vietnamese forces. This was not an oversight. It reflected a conscious decision about what kinds of information the reporting architecture would be designed to capture and aggregate. Enemy casualties were tracked through the body count system. Friendly casualties were tracked through the medical and personnel systems. Civilian casualties had no parallel systematic tracking mechanism, which meant that they appeared in the record only when individual incidents were reported and investigated, and the threshold for reporting and investigating was set by the same institutional culture that managed the body count and the Hamlet evaluation data. The estimates that exist come from multiple sources with different methodologies and different limitations. Vietnamese government estimates, South Vietnamese civilian medical records, provincial reports from American advisors, survey data collected by independent researchers, and epidemiological studies conducted after the war all produced different numbers, but they converged on a civilian death toll that was significantly larger than any figure derived from official American military sources. The Senate Subcommittee on Refugees and Escapees, which tracked civilian casualties throughout the war, produced estimates that were consistently higher than military figures and that were largely ignored in official policy discussions. The subcommittee's chairman, Edward Kennedy, wrote in internal correspondence that the military's unwillingness to track civilian casualties represented not just a statistical gap, but a deliberate structuring of ignorance. That phrase, a deliberate structuring of ignorance, describes something that appears repeatedly in the internal record across multiple aspects of the war. The decision not to track certain things, not to report certain things, not to investigate certain things was not random. It followed a logic. The logic was institutional preservation. An institution engaged in a war it could not win could continue to function as long as its internal metrics did not definitively establish that it could not win. The metrics were therefore designed, consciously or through the accumulated weight of institutional incentives, to remain ambiguous. Body counts could not be verified. Hamlet ratings were subjective. Kill ratios depended on an order of battle estimate that had been managed to produce the desired ratio. The intelligence assessments that contradicted the official narrative could be described as overly pessimistic. The war could always be described as progressing, because the metrics for progress had been constructed to permit that description. This had a specific effect on the men who executed the war at the ground level. It produced what military psychiatrists at the time described, and what later researchers examining the same populations described, as a particular form of cognitive and moral dissonance. The soldier in the field observed things he could not reconcile with any coherent narrative of mission or purpose. He cleared a village, and it was attacked again. He called in casualties, and the numbers were revised upward before they reached the after-action report. He was told his unit was operating in a pacified area, and then lost people to an ambush in that area. He participated in the destruction of infrastructure that was supposed to be rebuilt under the pacification program, and never saw the rebuilding. He watched South Vietnamese forces perform in ways that bore no relationship to the official characterization of the Vietnamization program as proceeding on schedule. The clinical record from this period is unusual in its specificity. Military psychiatrists serving in Vietnam, particularly in the war's later years, produced case notes and unit assessments that described soldiers and small unit leaders who had developed functional adaptations to the contradictions of their environment. These adaptations were not breakdowns. They were, in clinical terms, something closer to the opposite of breakdowns. They were sophisticated cognitive strategies for continuing to function in an environment that provided no coherent framework for understanding one's own actions. Some soldiers achieved this through a radical restriction of time horizon, confining their operational reality to the immediate mission, the immediate patrol, the immediate firefight, and refusing to engage with any larger framework that would have required them to evaluate their actions in terms of strategic meaning. Some achieved it through a kind of dark humor that stripped events of their emotional significance by treating them as absurd rather than tragic. Some achieved it through the cultivation of a professional identity that located its value in technical competence rather than in the moral or strategic justification for that competence. You did your job well. That was the framework. What the job was for did not enter the framework. These adaptations were functional in the narrow sense that they allowed soldiers to continue operating. They were damaging in ways that only became fully apparent after the war, when the frameworks that had been suppressed reasserted themselves in civilian environments that did not provide the same cognitive management that the military structure had offered. The high rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, substance abuse, homelessness, and suicide among Vietnam veterans compared to veterans of other conflicts have multiple explanations, including the particular nature of guerrilla warfare and the absence of a meaningful homecoming ritual. But the internal record suggests that the specific dissonance of fighting a war whose own institution had privately determined was unwinnable, and of maintaining the daily performance of mission and purpose in that context, produced a particular psychological burden that was in some ways distinct from the general burden of combat trauma. The Vietnamization program, announced by Richard Nixon in 1969, was the official strategy for transferring military responsibility to South Vietnamese forces and withdrawing American troops. The program was presented publicly as a structured transition based on demonstrated South Vietnamese military capability. The internal record describes something different. It describes a program whose timeline was driven primarily by domestic political considerations, specifically the need to reduce American casualties and troop numbers at a rate that was politically sustainable, and whose capability assessments were shaped by the same institutional pressures that had shaped every other assessment in the war. South Vietnamese units that could not perform the missions being transferred to them were nevertheless evaluated as capable, because the alternative evaluation would have required adjusting the withdrawal timeline, which was not politically viable. The 1971 Operation Lam Son 719, in which South Vietnamese forces conducted a ground incursion into Laos with American air support but without American ground troops, was designed in part as a test of Vietnamization, a demonstration that South Vietnamese forces could conduct major offensive operations independently. The operation's results were significantly worse than the official accounts described. South Vietnamese forces suffered heavy casualties, failed to achieve most of their operational objectives, and withdrew in conditions that most military observers described as a rout. The official American assessment of the operation, issued during the operation's progress, described initial objectives as achieved and South Vietnamese performance as satisfactory. The internal military assessment, available through later declassification, described the operation as a failure that revealed serious limitations in South Vietnamese command and logistics capability. The withdrawal was described in internal communications as an emergency extraction rather than a planned operational conclusion. The official press statements continued to describe the operation as proceeding according to plan until several days after it had concluded. The bombing of Cambodia, conducted secretly from 1969 through 1970 under the codename Operation Menu, represents one of the more precisely documented instances of institutional falsification in the war's record. The operation involved B-52 strikes against areas of Cambodia being used as NVA and NLF base areas and supply lines. The operation was kept secret from Congress and from the American public through a specific falsification of the official records. The standard reporting system required that each bombing mission produce a target report that accurately described where the bombs had been dropped. For Operation Menu missions that crossed the Cambodian border, the target coordinates were falsified. The official records indicated that the bombs had been dropped on South Vietnamese targets. The actual targets were in Cambodia. This was not a matter of classification, which would have allowed the accurate information to exist within the system under restricted access. It was falsification of the operational record itself. The falsification was accomplished through a dual reporting system. The crews who flew the missions were debriefed through the normal channels, but the coordinates they reported were replaced with South Vietnamese coordinates before the reports entered the standard record. A separate, highly restricted channel maintained the accurate coordinates. The existence of this system was revealed in Senate hearings in 1973, and it became part of the impeachment inquiry into Richard Nixon, though Cambodia did not become an article of impeachment. The officer who designed and administered the dual reporting system, Air Force Brigadier General Hal Knight, testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee that he had been ordered to create the system and had done so, and that he had later expressed reservations about it to his superiors. His testimony described the institutional logic that made the falsification feel like a normal administrative function rather than an extraordinary act of deception. That normalization of institutional deception is one of the consistent themes in the internal record from across the entire war. The people who managed the metrics, who wrote the public statements, who oversaw the reporting systems, were not in most cases people who thought of themselves as engaged in deception. They were people who thought of themselves as managing information in the service of a legitimate institutional purpose. They had absorbed, through years of institutional socialization, a framework in which the distinction between the accurate record and the public record was not a moral distinction, but an administrative one. Classified information existed to protect operational security. Optimistic public assessments existed to maintain political support for a necessary mission. Body counts existed to measure effectiveness, and if the methodology was imprecise, the trend lines were still meaningful. The dual reporting system existed to maintain operational security for a politically sensitive but militarily necessary program. Within that framework, the consistent production of false and misleading information was not felt as falsification. It was felt as information management. This is important because it explains why the institution did not correct itself even when it had the information necessary to do so. Correction would have required people to experience their own actions as false, and the framework they inhabited did not provide for that experience. The framework provided for operational security, political sensitivity, administrative discretion, and the responsible management of information that, if misunderstood, could be damaging to the mission. Within that framework, the soldier in the Mekong Delta who had just participated in the killing of civilians that would be reported as enemy killed in action was not living in the same moral universe as a soldier who had committed an atrocity. He was managing a reporting category in a context where the reporting categories had been designed without adequate precision. The problem, within the institutional framework, was definitional rather than moral. The My Lai massacre is the most publicly documented of the war crimes identified in the internal army investigation, and it is instructive partly because of what the investigation showed about the response of the chain of command rather than the acts themselves. The massacre, in which soldiers of Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, killed between 300 and 500 Vietnamese civilians in the hamlet of My Lai on March 16, 1968, was reported to the chain of command immediately after it occurred. The report that traveled upward described a successful operation against enemy forces with over 100 enemy killed in action. The report that eventually triggered an investigation came not through the chain of command, but through a letter written by a Vietnam veteran, Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard accounts of the massacre from soldiers who had been present and who wrote directly to Congress and to the Department of Defense in March 1969, a year after the event. The Army's subsequent investigation, conducted by Lieutenant General William Peers, examined not only the massacre itself, but the chain of command's response to it. The Peers report, completed in 1970 and partially declassified over subsequent years, found that the massacre had been covered up at multiple levels of command, from the company level through the division level. Officers who had been present during or immediately after the operation and who were aware that something other than a military engagement had occurred had not reported this up the chain. Officers at higher levels who had received information suggesting that civilian casualties had been inflicted had not pursued it. The operational report describing the action as a successful engagement against enemy forces had been accepted without scrutiny. The cover-up was not a coordinated conspiracy in the conventional sense. It was the institutional default behavior in the face of information that was incompatible with the institutional narrative. Information that did not fit the framework was not reported. Information that fit the framework was reported. The framework determined what existed. Peers identified 28 officers as having some level of culpability in the original crimes or the cover-up. The Army ultimately brought charges against 14 of them. All were either acquitted, had their charges dismissed, or had their convictions overturned on appeal. The only conviction that stood, that of Lieutenant William Calley, was subsequently reduced. Calley served 3.5 years of house arrest under a presidential order from Nixon before his sentence was commuted. The institutional response to the most extensively documented massacre of the war was minimal prosecution, administrative reassignment, and a public discussion that treated the event as exceptional rather than as evidence of systemic conditions. The medical records from Vietnam, particularly the records from the evacuation hospital system, tell a parallel story about the gap between official and actual. The official casualty numbers reported by the Pentagon tracked killed in action and wounded in action through a specific definitional framework. A soldier killed in action was one who died as a direct result of hostile fire. A soldier who died of wounds after being evacuated from the combat zone was classified differently. A soldier who died in a non-hostile incident, an accident, a drug overdose, a fight within the unit, was classified differently still. The official KIA numbers, which were the numbers that appeared in press reports and congressional testimony, were smaller than the total military death toll in ways that were accurate within the definitional framework and misleading within the general public understanding of what combat mortality meant. The wound statistics produced a different kind of distortion. The military tracked two categories of wound, those serious enough to require medical evacuation and those treated in the field and returned to duty. The ratio of wounds to deaths in Vietnam was significantly higher than in previous conflicts, primarily because helicopter evacuation had made it possible to save soldiers who would have died from their wounds in earlier wars. This was presented in official communications as evidence of improved medical capability, which it was, but it also meant that the number of soldiers who survived Vietnam with serious permanent disabilities was higher than in previous conflicts relative to the total casualty numbers. The long-term medical and disability costs of the war were therefore substantially higher than the official casualty numbers implied, and this discrepancy affected the actuarial calculations that were used for veterans' benefits planning, producing a systematic underestimate of the war's long-term cost to the veterans who fought it. Agent Orange represents perhaps the most sustained example of institutional management of inconvenient information in the war's medical legacy. The herbicide program in Vietnam, of which Agent Orange was the primary component, involved the aerial spraying of approximately 19 million gallons of chemical defoliants over approximately 4.5 million acres of South Vietnamese territory between 1962 and 1971. The program's stated purposes were to deny enemy forces cover and to destroy food crops in areas under NLF control. American troops operated in areas that had been sprayed. They handled the chemicals in the course of their duties. Some of them were present during spray operations. Their exposure to dioxin, the toxic contaminant in Agent Orange, was not tracked. Records of where and when spray operations occurred were maintained, but the relationship between individual soldier locations and spray operation records was not cross-referenced in the military's record-keeping systems. The Veterans Administration's response to veterans reporting health conditions that they attributed to Agent Orange exposure, beginning in the late 1970s and extending through the 1980s and 1990s, is documented in a series of internal studies, congressional investigations, and litigation records. The pattern is consistent. Veterans who reported exposure-related conditions found that the VA's evidentiary standards for linking their conditions to service were set at a level that was effectively impossible to meet, given the absence of individual exposure records. The VA commissioned studies. Some of those studies, particularly the studies conducted internally by the VA, produced findings that were described by independent reviewers as designed to minimize the established association between dioxin exposure and disease. The VA's own Agent Orange Advisory Committee, established in the early 1980s, included members who had relationships with chemical industry interests that were not always disclosed. The committee produced findings that were subsequently challenged by independent epidemiologists and by the National Academy of Sciences. The Agent Orange story extends beyond veterans to the Vietnamese population, where the health consequences were significantly larger in scale. Vietnamese health researchers documented elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, and other conditions in areas that had been heavily sprayed. The continued contamination of soil and water in former spray areas produced ongoing exposures that affected generations born after the war. The American government's recognition of its responsibility to Vietnamese victims of the herbicide program was slow, contested, and remains incomplete. The legal and diplomatic dimensions of this recognition were shaped by the same institutional reluctance to acknowledge adverse consequences that had characterized the management of veteran health claims. The documents produced by the Nixon administration's internal discussions about the war's exit reveal a specific and particularly cold form of strategic calculation. The administration's internal records, available through the Nixon Library and through declassification requests, show that by 1969, senior officials including Henry Kissinger had concluded that the United States could not achieve its stated objectives in Vietnam, defined as an independent, viable, non-communist South Vietnam. The conclusion was reached in private. The public strategy was to negotiate from a position of strength, which required continuing combat operations that were no longer expected to produce the outcomes they were nominally designed to achieve. The concept that Kissinger articulated internally and which has been described in various forms in the historical literature involved achieving a decent interval between American withdrawal and the collapse of the South Vietnamese government, a period long enough that the collapse would not be directly attributable to American withdrawal in the public perception. The soldiers who were killed in Vietnam between 1969 and 1973, after the administration had privately concluded that the war's stated objectives were not achievable, were killed in the service of an exit strategy rather than a military strategy. The distinction is not semantic. An exit strategy has different objectives than a military strategy, and it produces different operational decisions, and it imposes different costs on the people executing it. A military strategy requires maximizing the probability of achieving defined military objectives. An exit strategy requires maintaining a level of military activity sufficient to support the political narrative of negotiating from strength while accepting losses at a rate that is domestically sustainable. The soldiers executing operations in 1970 and 1971 were not told that the operational context had shifted from military strategy to exit management. The institutional narrative continued to describe military objectives. The institutional reality had moved on. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, were presented publicly as achieving peace with honor, the formula that Nixon had used throughout the negotiations to describe the desired outcome. The internal record describes the accords differently. Kissinger's internal assessments of the accords acknowledged that North Vietnamese forces would remain in South Vietnam following the ceasefire, that the ceasefire monitoring mechanisms were inadequate to prevent violations, and that the political provisions of the accords would in all probability not produce the stable political settlement they nominally required. These assessments were accurate. The accords did not produce a stable settlement. The war between North and South Vietnam continued after the ceasefire, with reduced American involvement, and the South Vietnamese government collapsed in April 1975, 2 years after the accords were signed. The soldiers who had spent their tours in Vietnam, who had executed the operations, who had managed the cognitive and moral demands of fighting in a war whose institutional logic had shifted away from their sacrifice without telling them, returned to a country that had by 1973 largely withdrawn its attention from the war. The homecoming experience for Vietnam veterans has been extensively documented and is well known in its general outlines. What is less commonly recognized is the specific contribution of the institutional record to the veterans' post-service experience. The gap between what veterans knew from direct experience and what the official record described created a particular form of social and psychological dislocation that was different from the simple absence of celebration. Veterans who had experienced the war's internal contradictions directly, who had participated in or witnessed actions that bore no relationship to the official narrative, found that the available public language for discussing the war did not accommodate their experience. The official narrative, even after it had shifted to acknowledge the war as a tragedy or a mistake, did not acknowledge the specific forms of institutional deception and moral erosion that had produced the experience veterans were trying to describe. The historical declassification process has been slow and uneven. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971 and subsequently published, provided the first comprehensive public view of the internal record, covering the period through 1967. The papers demonstrated that multiple administrations had engaged in systematic deception about the war's prospects and the basis for policy decisions. The political and legal battles surrounding their publication, and the Nixon administration's attempt to prevent publication through prior restraint, produced a Supreme Court ruling that remains important in First Amendment law. But the papers' impact on public understanding of the war was limited by their complexity, by the difficulty of translating a multi-thousand-page document study into public discourse, and by the political dynamics of 1971, in which attention was shifting toward domestic issues and the anti-war movement was already well established. The subsequent declassification of NSA intercepts, CIA assessments, White House recordings, and military operational records has continued to add detail to the picture the Pentagon Papers began to sketch. Each major declassification has produced findings that are consistent with the general picture while adding specificity to particular aspects of the institutional record. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, the alleged attack on American naval vessels on August 4, 1964, that provided the legislative basis for the major escalation of American involvement, has been examined through NSA signals intelligence records released in the early 2000s. Those records confirm that the second of the two alleged attacks, the one that triggered the congressional resolution, almost certainly did not occur as described, and that senior officials, including Robert McNamara, had access to intelligence during the period immediately following the alleged attack that raised serious doubts about whether any attack had occurred. The resolution was passed. The escalation proceeded. The doubts were managed rather than resolved. The signal intelligence records also document the extent to which North Vietnamese communications were being intercepted and analyzed throughout the war, and the extent to which that intelligence was being used selectively. Intelligence that supported current policy was incorporated into official assessments. Intelligence that contradicted current policy was described as ambiguous, as requiring additional analysis, as potentially reflecting North Vietnamese deception operations rather than North Vietnamese intent. The intelligence system produced information. The policy system determined which information entered the decision-making process. The interaction between the two systems was not the neutral information-to-policy flow that the official architecture described. It was a political and institutional negotiation in which information that was compatible with policy moved efficiently, and information that was incompatible with policy moved slowly or not at all. There are names in the internal record that are not famous names. Names of analysts who wrote memos that were not read, or were read and filed without action, or were read and actively suppressed. Names of officers who wrote after-action reports that contradicted the official narrative and found their reports revised before they entered the permanent record. Names of soldiers who reported incidents through the chain of command and found that their reports produced administrative consequences for them rather than for the incidents they were reporting. These are not the names that appear in histories of the war. They are the names in the footnotes of declassified documents, in the testimony transcripts of congressional hearings that did not receive significant press coverage, in the files of the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group, in the personnel records of individuals who were quietly reassigned rather than publicly disciplined. The institutional amnesia about these names is not accidental and it is not complete. The record exists. It has been partially declassified. It can be found by people who know where to look. What the record cannot do by itself is restore to those names the significance they had in the lives of the people who bore them and in the small institutional dramas they participated in. The analyst who wrote the memo that was suppressed experienced the suppression as a specific event in a specific institutional setting. The soldier who filed the report and received administrative consequences experienced those consequences in a specific unit, in a specific location at a specific point in the war. The history absorbs these specifics into generalities. The generalities are accurate as far as they go. They do not go as far as the specifics. The South Vietnamese perspective on the war's internal contradictions is an underrepresented dimension of the institutional record, partly because the relevant documents are in Vietnamese and have not been fully translated, and partly because the collapse of the South Vietnamese government in 1975 dispersed the administrative apparatus whose records would have provided the most direct evidence. What survives in American archives, through diplomatic cables, Cords reports, CIA station reports, and the testimony of South Vietnamese officials who emigrated after 1975, suggests that the South Vietnamese government and military were operating under their own version of the gap between official narrative and institutional reality, and that the two gaps were not always compatible with each other. The American institutional narrative required the South Vietnamese government to be viable, legitimate, and progressively capable of self-defense. The actual South Vietnamese political situation was characterized by factional competition among military and civilian elites, by the significant penetration of the government's administrative apparatus by NLF informants, by corruption in the distribution of American economic assistance, and by the persistent inability of the Saigon government to extend its political legitimacy to the rural population. The Americans who were supposed to be building South Vietnamese institutional capacity were often aware of these conditions from direct observation. Their reporting, which is available in diplomatic cables from the period, frequently described the situation accurately. The official public assessments continued to describe the South Vietnamese government as progressing toward viability. Both descriptions existed simultaneously within the same institutional record. The American military advisors who worked most closely with South Vietnamese units had access to the most direct evidence of the Vietnamization program's actual progress. Their reports, many of which have been declassified, describe units that were unable to perform the missions they were nominally capable of performing, command structures that were shaped by patronage rather than competence, logistics systems that did not function at the level required for independent operations. The advisors who wrote these reports were generally not the people whose assessments shaped the official narrative. The official narrative was shaped at higher levels, where the institutional and political requirements of the Vietnamization timeline determined the interpretation of the field reports rather than the other way around. The final year of direct American military involvement, from the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 through the fall of Saigon in April 1975, produced its own archive of suppressed and managed information. The Nixon administration had obtained congressional approval for continued military and economic assistance to South Vietnam, as part of the framework that allowed the withdrawal of American ground forces. When that assistance was reduced by Congress, first through legislative restrictions on bombing, and then through reductions in appropriations, the administration described the reductions as abandoning a commitment and as making the ultimate collapse inevitable. The internal record of what American officials believed about the South Vietnamese military's ability to sustain operations without American support suggests that the administration's public position was more confident than its private assessments warranted. The knowledge that South Vietnamese forces were dependent on American support at a level that made independent sustainability questionable was available within the system. It did not change the public commitment narrative. The fall of Saigon in April 1975, the images of helicopters on the embassy roof and the evacuation of American personnel and some South Vietnamese allies was described in official American statements as a humanitarian operation conducted under difficult circumstances. The internal record of the evacuation planning, which has been extensively documented by researchers examining State Department and CIA archives, describes a situation in which the planning was delayed by political considerations, specifically the unwillingness of the Ford administration to appear to be preparing for the South Vietnamese government's collapse, which would have been inconsistent with the official narrative that the government was capable of continued resistance. The delay in evacuation planning meant that fewer South Vietnamese who had worked with American forces and agencies were evacuated than could have been evacuated with earlier preparation. The number of South Vietnamese who were left behind and who subsequently experienced imprisonment, re-education, or death as a result is not precisely established, but it is significantly higher than the number who were evacuated. The institutional response to the war's end was not, in the main, a reckoning with the internal record. It was, in the main, a process of compartmentalization. The lessons identified, the institutional process by which military and civilian organizations extract operational guidance from experience, produced documents that addressed tactical and logistical matters rather than the fundamental institutional dysfunctions that the internal record documented. The Army's post-Vietnam studies examined combined arms doctrine, helicopter assault tactics, counterinsurgency strategy, and logistical support systems. They did not, with any significant depth, examine the body count system, the management of intelligence that contradicted official policy, the dual reporting system used for the Cambodian bombing, or the institutional culture that had produced decades of systematic misrepresentation. The examination that did occur was conducted in classified settings and produced classified documents. The public record of institutional learning from Vietnam was carefully bounded. The congressional investigations of the mid-1970s, including the Church Committee's examination of intelligence activities and the various hearings on the war's conduct, produced significant public documentation of specific programs and specific abuses. The Phoenix Program, the bombing of Cambodia, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the management of intelligence, the surveillance of domestic anti-war activists by military intelligence units, all received public examination. The investigations produced findings. The findings produced some legislative responses, including the War Powers Resolution and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. They did not produce a comprehensive public accounting of the gap between the official record and the actual record throughout the war's duration. The investigations examined specific programs and specific abuses. They did not examine the institutional culture and incentive structures that had produced those programs and abuses as normal outputs rather than exceptional deviations. The veterans who returned from Vietnam and who have spent the decades since trying to reconcile their experience with the official record have contributed their own archive to the documentation of the gap. Oral history projects, memoir literature, documentary film, the testimony of veterans before various official bodies, the persistent advocacy work of veterans organizations, and the informal networks through which veterans have shared accounts that never entered any official record have produced a substantial parallel documentation of the war's actual texture. This archive is uneven in its reliability, as all memory-based archives are, and it requires the same critical evaluation as any other source. But at the aggregate level, across thousands of individual accounts collected by researchers and journalists and veterans themselves, it describes a war that is substantially consistent with what the declassified institutional record shows and substantially inconsistent with what the official public record described at the time. The gap between those descriptions has not closed. New declassifications continue to add detail. Researchers continue to find documents that illuminate specific episodes or institutional decisions that had been obscured. The broad architecture of what happened, including what was known and when it was known, and how that knowledge was managed, is no longer seriously contested by historians who work with the primary sources. What remains contested is what to do with that architecture. How to incorporate it into a national understanding of the war that is accurate without being simply accusatory, that acknowledges institutional dysfunction without reducing the experience of the individuals who operated within that dysfunction to a single moral category. The men who died in Vietnam, all of them, American, Vietnamese, North and South, military and civilian, died in a war that was being managed at its highest levels, with objectives and with an understanding of the situation that were not the objectives and understanding they were told they were serving. That gap between what the war was and what it was said to be did not make the experience of fighting it less real. It made it more difficult to understand, and the difficulty of understanding it did not end when the fighting stopped. The last American combat troops left Vietnam in 1973. The military assistants and advisory personnel who remained were evacuated in 1975. The war continued, in its Vietnamese dimensions, for years after the American departure, and in its effects on the people who fought it, for the remainder of their lives. The classified files in the National Archives that have not yet been fully processed, the boxes of CORDS reports and CIA station assessments and Criminal Investigation Division records that researchers have not yet worked through, continue to hold details that have not yet entered the public account. The declassification process continues at its bureaucratic pace. The people whose experiences those documents record are aging. Some of them have died. The distance between the document and the experience it represents grows as the years pass, and the institutional memory of what the documents meant, in context, in real time, to people who were there, becomes harder to reconstruct. The administrative record persists. The living memory does not. And the war, by every metric that the reporting systems designed to measure it actually captured, was still being recorded as producing favorable trends in its final weeks of American involvement. because the metrics had been built to produce that result, and they continued to function exactly as they had been designed to function.